Well, thank you so much for coming. It's a real honor to be here. Can you all hear me? So I'm going to tell you about 7 themes of the Constitution with particular reference to the presidency, which is the most personal and vivid and concrete of the constitutional offices. 3 of these themes come from a book that I wrote called America's Constitution, a biography. It's available probably even downstairs in the Barnes and Nobles. It's a Random House book. It's written for a general audience, for you or your son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter who might be in AP History or AP Government in high school, all the way up for a law professor. I see my student Bart Shevchik here, who's in the law professor business. So it targets a sort of a wide audience. America's Constitution, a biography, and it takes you through the written Constitution from start to finish. And I'm going to have 3 themes from that book that I'm going to connect to the American presidency. And the more recent book, the sequel, is called America's Unwritten Constitution. As you heard, it's going to be available after this lecture. And I'll give you 4 themes from it. But just in a nutshell, the first book takes you through the written Constitution from start to finish. It takes you through this terse text from the preamble through Articles 1, 2, 3 in sequence to the end of the original document, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and to the end of the original document, Article 7, and then through the amendments, which are added as so many postscripts and post-postscripts and PPSs, like a careless written letter, but added in chronological order. And so the last third of the book really takes you, the reader, forward in time from the founding era through the Civil War, the Progressive Era amendments, the 1960s. So that book walks you through the written Constitution from start to finish. The sequel is America's Unwritten Constitution, the precedents and principles we live by, is a reminder that not everything in our constitutional system is set forth in so many words in this terse text, and yet it really, many of these things really are genuinely part of our constitutional system. Separation of powers, federalism, the rule of law, limited government, and so on. So I'm going to tell you about 3 themes from the first book, 4 themes from the next book, and each time I'm trying to connect it to the presidency, just so you can kind of maybe remember the big themes with a very specific, concrete, vivid set of illustrations. So here are my 3 claims from the first book about the basic nature of America's Constitution. It is more democratic than we were taught, more pro-slavery, slavocratic than has conventionally been understood, and much more about national security and geostrategy than the standard story suggests. So democratic, slavocratic, national security oriented, geostrategic. In a word, our Constitution, and here's one easy way to remember it, basically is our original Constitution is Jacksonian. It paves the way for Jacksonian America. Andrew Jackson is the dominant figure in antebellum America because the Constitution is actually designed for someone like him. He's a Democrat. Small d Democrat, low-born, man of the people, capital D Democrat. He heads a party that proudly calls itself the Democrat Party. He's a slavocrat. He is pro-slavery, and this is central to his success. And he is all about national security. He doesn't much like foreigners. He's about geographic expansion. He can beat the British, and indeed did at the Battle of New Orleans. That's why he becomes president. So the original Constitution is going to create the conditions for basically Jackson's America. So if you forget what this lecture was all about, just open up your go to an ATM, open up your wallet, you'll see these green pieces of paper with Andrew Jackson smiling at you, and that Constitution fails. It fails because of its pro-slavery tilt, because it was a house divided against itself that fell. And so the Constitution that we live in today is more Lincolnian than Jacksonian, but that's because the system, as I said, self-destructed as a result of its compromises with slavery. So those are going to be the first 3 themes, and then the last 4 from the new book. A lot of the Constitution is unwritten, and in particular, with regard to the presidency, ours is a Georgian Constitution. Much of what presidents have done and should do and will continue to do is defined not by what the text of Article 2, which is the presidential article in the Constitution, says, but rather by what George Washington did. The first precedents set by the first president to fundamentally define the nature of the presidency in all sorts of ways that I'll try to illustrate for you. I'll also try to talk about how our Constitution is a partisan Constitution, in which political parties play a very big role, even though their presence in the terse text is not very obvious at all, really non-existent in the original document. But ours is a partisan, a two-party Constitution with a partisan presidency, and I'll try to explain how that comes about. I'll also tell you about how you have to read between the lines, and various amendments that have happened over time have importantly transformed the nature of the presidency. I'm going to talk in particular about the 19th Amendment, the Woman Suffrage Amendment, and the way in which it actually fundamentally changed our presidency in all sorts of ways. So we're not just going to talk about founders here. The Constitution is an intergenerational project, and we have to think about the amendments as well as the original document. And finally, ours is an unfinished Constitution. One way of understanding an unwritten Constitution is to think about the Constitution still to be written. What will Amendment 28 look like, and 29? And I'm going to give you some thoughts about what the Constitution of the future, the Constitution still to be written, the unfinished Constitution, will look like and should look like. And I'm going to illustrate that with a couple of specific examples of how the constitutional law of the presidency will and should change as we move into the future. So, more democratic than you thought. How does it begin? We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution, and that's so second nature to us all that you might not really appreciate exactly what's going on here. Those words are the hinge of human history. They are the Big Bang. They change everything. If you are a Christian, you divide the world between BC and AD. If you are trying to think about secular time, the modern world is divided similarly between BC and AD, before the Constitution and after the document. 1787-88 is the year that changed everything in the world, because we, the people of the United States, did ordain and establish a Constitution. What do I mean by that? Look at the world in 1787. Democracy, self-government almost nowhere on the planet. Outside the New World, only in Britain, which has still a hereditary monarch and an aristocratic House of Lords, an established church. It has a House of Commons, but in order actually to serve in the House of Commons, you need to own or rent real property generating an annual income of 600 pounds sterling. It's not at all a place for common folk. You have to basically own an estate, something like, if you're a Jane Austen fan, Darcy's Pemberley or something like that, or Bingley's estate. But outside the New World, there's Britain, which has some amount of self-government, House of Commons, jury trial, elections every so often, and Switzerland, and that's it, the entire world. And so it has been for all of recorded history. A few tiny democratic experiments that survived for a while over tiny stretches of time and space. Athens, ancient Athens, pre-imperial Rome, and then blinked out because they weren't able to protect themselves against external attack or internal dissension. But the history of the world in 1787 and for all of recorded history before that, it's basically a history of kings, emperors, czars, sultans, Mughal lords, tribal chieftains, thugs. That's what it is. And now you look at the world today, and half of the world by geography and by population is democratic, and that is because of the success of the United States Constitution and its constitutional project. Legally, militarily, politically, culturally, economically, socially, The world is becoming American in some fundamental ways because in 1787-88, we, the people of the United States, did ordain and establish a constitution. It's the hinge of all of human history. They put the thing to a vote. Okay? They didn't do that ever in ancient Athens. Even the places that had democratic systems, democratic politeia, constitutions, never had fully democratic constitution-making processes. Typically, one person, the lawgiver, Solon, would hand down the law from on high, Moses on Sinai, Lycurgus. But in the British Constitution, it's not a document. It's a set of institutions, practices, customs, traditions that have accreted and evolved over time. But the fundamental principles were never reduced to a single text that ordinary farmers could read and think about and decide whether they were for it or against it. So the British Constitution never put to a vote. The Articles of Confederation, the predecessor document to this in America, not put to a vote. Declaration of Independence, 1776, not put to a vote. The state constitutions in 1776, as these independent colonies now established their own systems of government. No constitution in 1776 was put to a vote of the people of that state. So this is big news. We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this constitution, putting the thing to a vote. And in this vote, more people were allowed to participate than had ever been allowed to participate in anything before in human history, and by vast orders of magnitude. An entire continent getting to vote. In 8 of the 13 states, ordinary property qualifications were lowered or eliminated compared to what they were the day before for ordinary elections. In New York, for example, here are the rules for who can vote in the Constitution. You can be for it or against it. All adult free male citizens get to vote. No race tests. Now, if you're a slave, of course, you don't get to, but no race tests for free blacks, no property qualifications, no literacy tests, no religious tests. It's stunning. The world will never be the same. And to repeat, in 8 of the 13 states, the property qualifications are lowered or eliminated. Nowhere are they raised. And the fix is not in. The Constitution barely goes through in New York, 30 to 27. It's a pretty fair vote as votes go. And you can be for the thing or against it, and no one shuts you down. No one dies in this year. No one is suppressed. Think about the world. Think about Syria. Think about Egypt. Today, this is radical. It's stunning. It's the hinge of human history. An entire continent for a year getting to decide how they and their posterity would be governed. In 1776, this doesn't happen. Not put to a vote. And basically, here's the conversation in 1776. Either you're for the Constitution, because the King of England has already sent over troops. Lexington conquered, Bunker Hill, they've already happened. 30,000 troops are about to arrive, and when they arrive, they're going to slit our throats. This is not a philosophy seminar. This is war. You're for us or you're against us. You're with us or not. And if you're not, here are your choices. 1, shut up. 2, leave. That's it. Those are your only 2 choices. No one who opposes the Declaration of Independence in 1776 goes on to any position of authority in America. They get voted off the island, in effect. Now, the people who oppose to the Constitution, because they speak up against it, they become presidents of the United States. James Monroe. Vice President of the United States, George Clinton from this state in New York, Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, justices on the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase. It's stunning. Stunning free speech. This is not what you were taught. Whether you know it or not, you were taught that the Constitution is fundamentally kind of anti-democratic document. It's about the propertied people, trying to repress the democratic exuberance and excesses of the American Revolution. Democracy was a dirty word. You were taught hogwash. It's just not true. I know that this is what you were taught. It's the most influential book about the Constitution. It came from this city. It was authored in 1913. Does anyone know what the name of the book is? That influenced all of you, whether you read it or not. All of your teachers followed a book by a man named Charles Beard called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution that presented this as like of, by, and for the property people, but it wasn't. You see, property is actually mentioned only once in the document, and that in reference to government property. It was hugely democratic. Beard was simply wrong on his facts. And so I'm not a falsely modest person. I'm trying to write the most ambitious book about the Constitution in this century, and it begins by telling you that Beard was fundamentally wrong. The Constitution is by far the most democratic project going at the time, and even today, it's pretty extraordinary for the breadth of his participation. And democracy was not a dirty word. If it was a dirty word, why does the most dominant, the most powerful political institution in antebellum America call itself the Democrat Party, which is based on Jefferson and Madison, who founded the Republican Party, the Democrat-Republican Party, potato, potato. They didn't think it was different. If you've taken, if you know classical languages, you know democracy, simply Greek, demos kratia, rule by the demos, by the people, a counterpart to the Latin res publica, the people's thing, the public's thing. What property qualifications? Now, if you're going to put to a vote, are people going to vote for the thing if it disfranchises them, and it has all these? No. So, what property qualifications do you need in order to be a member of the House of Representatives? Exactly, none. How about for the Senate? Exactly. Now, no state constitution has zero property qualifications for its upper house, but the U.S. Constitution has zero property qualifications for its upper house. And what property qualifications do you need to be President of the United States? Zero. That's not true of any governor at the time. What religious qualifications? This is extraordinarily open to talent. To low-born people, to the future Andrew Jacksons of the world, to the Abe Lincolns and the Bill Clintons and the Barack Obamas. And zero religious qualifications. No state constitution has a guarantee, and in fact the Constitution guarantees there will be no religious tests. No state constitution has such a provision. And in 11 of the state constitutions, there actually are religious qualifications built into the state constitution. New York is in the process of adding one statutorily. Only Virginia has zero religious qualifications, and that's merely by statute rather than by constitutional. Right. Now, you were taught the Constitution isn't so democratic. The House of Representatives, it's elected. It wasn't elected under the Articles of Confederation. It's more democratic than went before. And the presidency is a strongly democratic position, open. Now, what qualifications are there to be president? You have to be 35. So what's up with that? So who's that all about? See, it's not about any person, because George Washington is going to be president as long as he wants, so it's not about any existing 33-year-old. But who possibly could have the name recognition to get elected president at the age of 27 or 31? And the answer is a famous son of a famous father. And 35 is actually saying, no, you should not, it's anti-dynastic. You should not get elected president just because of your name. You have to have a track record of your own. Who is Prime Minister of England when they come up with this rule? William Pitt, the younger, whose daddy, William Pitt the elder, was prime minister, and you might like the younger, you might like, he may be good, he may be bad, but he's a member of parliament at 21 and prime minister at 24, and he's getting it because of his daddy's name, and we're not going to let you do that in America. Okay? And so of the early presidents, none of them has a son, at least a legitimate one that we know about, except for George Washington has no sons. Thomas Jefferson, no sons that we know about. James Madison, no sons. James Monroe, no sons. Now, John Adams has a son, and his name is Q as in W, and you've heard of him, but he gets elected in his own right after a track record of service on his own, because when his dad leaves office, he's not even Q isn't even 35. Okay? So the presidency is a remarkably democratic institution, reflecting a remarkably democratic constitution, people of all faiths, and two of the four guys up there on Mount Rushmore, Jefferson and Lincoln, not conventional churchgoers. Very open document. Low-born, Lincoln, Obama, Gerald Ford, Bill Clinton, Andrew Jackson. Not the story you were told, which is about a bunch of aristocrats favoring themselves. That's basically not true to the facts. Okay. You see in the presidency more democratic than you thought. Now, more pro-slavery than we've been taught. Professor, how can it be both pro-democracy and pro-slavery? Well, all the democracies had slavery. The Greeks give us both, Democracy, and here I'm going to anticipate my discussion of foreign policy, is about protecting the people, but it's not always for the benefit of other peoples. This Constitution is designed for the benefit of Americans, not for the benefit of the Brits, or the French, or the Spanish, or the Indians, or the slaves, who are understood as sort of aliens, the foreign people. The Greeks enslaved barbarians who didn't speak Greek, and they sounded to the Greeks as if they were just saying bar, bar, bar. That's why they were called barbarians. That's what, so it can be, democracies historically had been slaveholding societies too. It's about us versus them, and slaves were them, not part of we, the people. And the Constitution is way more slavocratic than we've been taught. Beard should have talked about that, but didn't. Professor, if they were so pro-democracy, why do they have an indirect system of presidential election? You were taught, we have the Electoral College, raise your hands, because they didn't believe in democracy. And so we had to have that sort of a filtered group of people. Raise your hand if you were taught. I was taught this, come on now. You were, I'm sure that many of you were I'm only seeing like 6 hands, 25, 30, most of you were actually taught we have an Electoral College. I mean, and if you haven't, boy, I've succeeded beyond my wildest expectations, because only in the last 10 years has it really been acknowledged why we really have an electorate. It's not that they didn't believe in democracy, but that's what Charles Beard said. You were taught it's a balance between big and small states. Raise your hands if that's what you were taught. Simple question. If so, why does the big state guy always win? We've only had 3 small state presidents in all of American history. Bill Clinton, Zachary Taylor, Franklin Pierce, that's it. Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire, Zachary Taylor of Louisiana, and Bill Clinton of Arkansas. That's it. George Washington, big state, small state, comes from Virginia. Big state, the biggest. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, the biggest. John Quincy Adams, the second, or Massachusetts, the second or third biggest, depending on you count, and then John Quincy too. It's always the big state guy. It's not a big, House versus Senate, that's big versus small state. Electoral College, no, it's not that. Anti-democracy, no, that's not why they had it, because I've given you already a lot of evidence that they really are quite proud Democrats. They believe in direct election of governors. They believe in an elected House of Representatives, which you didn't have in the Articles of Confederation. So why do we have the Electoral College? What would James Carville tell you in one word, in one sentence? It's slavery, stupid. We have the Electoral College because in a direct election world, the South loses every time because a huge proportion of its population is slave and they don't vote. But with an Electoral College, they get to count their slaves, albeit at a discount, the 3/5 clause, and who's going to be the big winner? Let's see, a big state with a lot of slaves. Can you spell Virginia? Biggest state, huge number of slaves. 32 of the first 36 years, who's present? A plantation-owning, slave-holding Virginian. In 1800, Pennsylvania has more people, free people, than Virginia. Way more voters than Virginia. Way fewer electoral votes than Virginia because of the 3/5 clause. Who wins the election when Thomas Jefferson goes up against John Adams in 1800, 1801? Thomas Jefferson. It's the Virginian against the Massachusetts person. The lineup is south against north. But you take away the extra, and the swing state at the time where north meets south, today it's called Ohio. What was it then, where north meets south? Slave state, where kind of north meets south. Swing state, Adams wins the first time around against Jefferson. Jefferson wins the second time because one state swings. I got a hint. I give you a hint. You're living in it. Okay? New York is the Ohio of the time. Aaron Burr will deliver New York, which is a slave state. New York has more slaves in 1820 than Georgia. Than Missouri. And at the founding, New York and New Jersey have more than Georgia. Okay. Jefferson wins the South. He's the Southerner. Adams wins the North. He's the Northerner. Both times New York swings, but without the extra electoral votes created by 3/5, Adams wins the second time around too. The only reason Jefferson wins is that his states get extra clout because they've got slavery, and so you can count that population. That's okay. So this, I'm giving you with concrete application to the presidency. Your early presidents, they're Virginians, okay, because that's the big winner. Big state, slave state. It's democratic and it's slavocratic. It's and it's going to lead to Jacksonian America. It's all about national security. The Constitution creates 13 separate colonies and turns them into one indivisible nation. It's the world's largest corporate merger. What's up with that? Democracy had never existed on this wide geographic scale before this project. It exists in tiny city-states where people speak the same language. They meet face-to-face in Athens and speak the same language and worship the same god or gods and have the same common culture and climate. And warm weather and cold weather people have never gotten together in different time zones, and that's what's being proposed. And if you're an ordinary farmer, you would say, why are we doing this? Let me be clear about what the Constitution is proposing. World government for a new world separated by vast oceanic moats from the old world. It would be as if today someone actually seriously proposed to you, we're going to have a world government with a president of the world and an elected legislature of the world that will tax you as an individual, and you will be required maybe perhaps to serve in a world army, and that's what we're going to have. And you'd say, what the heck? I mean, there's only one imaginable thing that would ever get you to vote for such a proposition. Yes, Martians. Yes, if the aliens were coming, you'd say, well, we don't really love the Chinese, the Russians all that much, but they are Homo sapiens, so what the hell, we're in. And that's why the United States Constitution, it was not, Charles Beard said it's all about property, it's about protecting the rich guys against the poor guys. No. It's not about what divided us, about what we had in common. It's about basically, here's what will happen, my fellow Americans. Have you read the Federalist Papers? Any of you in high school, were you assigned a Federalist paper? Do you remember which Federalist paper you were assigned? Federalist number? Any of you remember? You were assigned Federalist number 1051. These are a series of op-eds in New York newspapers. If you had a good argument for why you're going to trade what we've got for door number 3, which is world government, would you wait till your 10th op-ed to make it? Your 51st? No, of course you wouldn't. The key argument for union is not in the Federalist 10 or 50. Federalist 10 becomes important because a man like Charles Beard 100 years ago told us it was important, but no one paid any attention to it before. Here's what the argument was. Look around the world, who is free in all the world? I told you who was free and self-governing in all the world in 1787. Who's free in 1787 other than us Americans? The Brits, and who else? The Swiss, that's it. Why? Because they have defensible borders, okay? Because the English Channel creates a natural moat, and it's hard to charge up the Great Wall of the Alps. You look at a map in 1943, 150 years later, after 1943, look at a map of Europe, who's free? The Brits and the Von Trapps in Switzerland. For the same fundamental reason, because Hitler doesn't want to have to launch an amphibious invasion, and it's hard to charge up the Alps. Defend our friends in Israel would understand this. It's about defensible borders. My fellow Americans, here are your choices. You divide into 13 separate colonies. You start fighting against each other. Land borders, Britain and France and Germany, Britain and France and Spain will play us off against each other. We're going to start killing each other. That's the history of the world. Or we can be like Britain, form an indivisible union of Scotland and England, and we have an island. We can rely on this huge moat, the English Channel times 50, called the Atlantic Ocean. Small navy will be all we need. We won't need a big army. Tiny army will suffice to kick the Brits out, kick the Spanish out, kick the French out, kill the Indians, control the continent from sea to shining sea, manifest destiny, the Monroe Doctrine, and no one will mess with us. That is the Constitution's program. The reason America is free for most of its history is not the Bill of Rights, not courts. There's no standing army in peacetime of any significance for the first 150 years because of our splendid geographic isolation. It's a geostrategic concept. And we keep trying to replicate it today, even though it doesn't exist anymore with Star Wars and because today you see this model made sense for a long time because we were separated by vast oceanic moats from the rest of the world, from an old world that was tyrannical. Until 9/11, the last time foreigners draw blood on American soil is the War of 1812. Okay? But that's not the world you live in anymore, because now you have intercontinental missiles and nuclear submarines just right off your coast, and international terrorism and pandemic viruses. The Russians are coming. They're called viruses and climate change, and so the world that we have today is different, and the rest of the world is democratic in a way that it wasn't before. So actually, we need to start talking about world government and people in this city. How many blocks are we from the UN? You have to try to think about how this stuff that happened 225 years ago requires some updating. But at the founding, it's a geostrategic document. It's designed to create an indivisible landmass that will be easily defensible without a big standing arm. Who's your first president? Yes, he's a Virginian. What else do we know about him? We know he has no sons, so he's not going to try to create a throne because he has no one to give it to. And he actually says that in the first draft of his inaugural address. He understands the anti-dynastic concern. He says, you can trust me because I've got no son to give it to. Okay? So he becomes father of his country because he's not father of his own children. So he's from a big state. Okay? That's one thing for Washington, big slaveholding state. He's not going to threaten to create a dynasty because he's got no son of his own. But what's the third reason you want Washington as your first president? Because he can beat the Brits, okay, and not threaten the rest of America. He actually had an army and disbanded it. All your early presidents, every single one, are international, national security figures. They are either battlefield generals and or in effect, secretaries of state. If you count John Adams as the Secretary of State de facto under the Articles of Confederation, we didn't have a thing called Secretary of State, but he, along with Franklin and John Jay, was one of America's 3 leading diplomats. Every single president until Lincoln, elected president, is a battlefield general and or America's leading diplomat, with only one exception. Anyone know who the exception is? Every single one. So you can see all these things in the presidency. You can see the democracy, the low-born quality, and anti-dynastic quality. You can see the pro-slavery aspect. Oh, all your early presidents, every single one is either a Southerner or a Northern man of Southern sympathies until Lincoln. They're all pro-slavery or not anti-slavery. Not a single president before Lincoln is going to get up and say, slavery is wrong and we should eventually get rid of it, because you can't do that and win in the Electoral College until Lincoln. No cabinet officer ever says that. Not like we should get rid of slavery tomorrow. Just no president says before Lincoln, slavery is wrong, we should eventually get rid of it. Maybe it'll take us 100 years, but we should eventually do it. No one says that until Lincoln, because it's democratic and slavocratic, this system. But it's also national security oriented until Lincoln. There's only one elected president who's not a battlefield general or in effect Secretary of State. Anyone remember who it is? It's James Polk. That's it. So who's Andrew Jackson? Remember Jackson. If you forget what I've been saying thus far, Andrew Jackson. He is the dominant political figure in antebellum America. Small d, low-born, capital D, Democrat, man of the people. Very pro-slavery, and his party is extremely pro-slavery. It's going to give you Dred Scott and really destroy the Union. And he hates foreigners. And he can beat the British Battle of New Orleans, and he doesn't like any other foreigners, and he doesn't like Indians either, and doesn't like black people. That's actually, or at least slaves, that's your Constitution. Pro-slavery, pro-democracy, pro-national security. And it fails because of its pro-slavery elements. And so Lincoln is so unusual precisely because he doesn't have any of the typical credentials, just because people begin to see that slavery is going to be the death of us, and we got to actually have a different approach to the thing. So he has no national security credentials. He's not a leading diplomat or general. He's very much, he's not a Southerner or a Northern man of Southern sympathies. He's anti-slavery. He's not an abolitionist, but he's a very different kind of character, and you can see how his election is going to precipitate this cataclysm. And he resists unilateral secession, rightly so, because it's an indivisible geostrategic union, and we all fought and bled for New Orleans, and you can't let the people in that little place turn the guns around, because we all defended those guns against the Brits. Because if they control New Orleans, they control the entire region from the Appalachians to the Rockies that drains through that. You can't let the people in Fort Sumter turn those guns around into the bellies of everyone else who had expended their own blood and treasure to defend South Carolina against the British depredations in the Revolutionary War. Lincoln understands the geostrategic nature of the Union. He understands the deep democratic idea that government of the people, for the people, by the people, cannot exist if those who lose a fair election are able to undo it by force of arms. All the great European democratic reforms have failed in 1848. We're the only major democratic project going, and if secession is allowed to succeed, basically democracy is a mockery, and the world will not be the one that we have today, this democratic world. He understands that we are the last best hope of Earth, this democratic project, and we can't allow people who lose elections fair and square to undo them by force of arms. Rick Perry. And in the wake of the Civil War, a pro-slavery constitution becomes an amazingly anti-slavery constitution with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay, those are the themes of that first book, America's Constitution, a biography with particular illustrations of from the presidency. I hope you learned some facts about the presidency, about the Electoral College and who's present and why, and that you may not have known before. Now let me move, and in the next I'll try to wrap up in 15 minutes. Will that work? And then we'll have a conversation. Identify 4 additional themes that are themes of the new book, America's Unwritten Constitution, the precedents and principles we live by. Here's one theme, because I hope you heard, I have a real affection for and reverence for this text, and it's hugely important. It changes everything in the world, and I wouldn't want to lose the benefits of written constitution, but we have to go beyond it, because there's so much that's part of our system and that's not here, and the trick is going behind it without losing faith with it and breaking faith with it. So let's talk about what presidents actually do today, because when you read Article 2, it doesn't tell you very much. Why is it absolutely clear to everyone that Barack Obama alone and at any time of his choosing gets to decide whether we will recognize the Syrian rebels as the lawful government of Syria, as he chose at a certain point to recognize the Libyan rebels as the government of Libya? The text doesn't say this very clearly. The closest it says is the president shall receive ambassadors, which could be understood as just a matter of etiquette and politeness, that politesse, that when you arrive in the U.S., you present your credentials to the president because Congress might not be in session, something like that. But so the textual basis is pretty much non-existent. But it's understood, no one denies that Obama can do this. Why? Because George Washington did it. It's the unwritten precedent set by the first precedent set by our first president. He and he alone decided at a certain point he was going to recognize the French revolutionaries as the legitimate government of France, even though they basically, were in the process of guillotining the guy who bankrolled the American Revolution, Louis. And he has to decide, because if Louis is going to make a comeback, he's not going to like this very much. That if we start paying the money back to the revolutionaries rather than to him and the Dauphin. So wrong call is really, could be very dangerous. You don't want to annoy Angela Merkel, but the president has to make these calls, okay? He and he alone unilaterally decides to recognize the French revolutionaries and thereby establishes what is called the recognition power today, which is elementary, bedrock. Everyone accepts it. It's not in the written constitution. It's because of what George Washington did. On issue after issue, this is a chapter in the new book, it's called America's Georgian Constitution, following Washington's lead. Presidents, in the same way the Christian asks himself, what would Jesus do? Presidents rightly ask themselves, what would George Washington do? What did George Washington do? Pick another. Why is it so clear to everyone that on day one, Obama could replace Paulson with the person of his choice, Geithner, but he couldn't replace Bernanke with the person of his choice? He can do so now, but not on day one of his first. Because where does the Constitution say the head of the the Federal Reserve is different than the Secretary of the Treasury? It doesn't. But under George Washington, a precedent was established called the Decision of 1789 that cabinet officers answer to the president on a removable at will, that Alexander Hamilton of this city served at George Washington's pleasure. But that's not true of all government officials, but that is true of cabinet secretaries. So it's not what the text says, it's actually the precedents established by George Washington. Where does it say that Jimmy Carter can unilaterally break a treaty with Taiwan and instead recognize the People's Republic of China? It doesn't say that presidents can unilaterally break treaties, but George Washington asserted this power, actually. Where does it say the presidents can send secret envoys? Richard Nixon sending Henry Kissinger to China secretly before Carter comes along. Well, it doesn't, but George Washington sends Gouverneur Morris as a secret envoy to Britain without even getting the Senate's consent to this. So on all sorts of issues, what actually matters, this is our unwritten Constitution, is not just what the text says, but what George did. He takes this, see, why is the text so short? So that an ordinary farmer could read it and decide whether he's for or against it. But if it's going to be short enough for an ordinary farmer to read, it's not going to be able to specify everything. So it's going to need to be supplemented in certain ways. And on the presidency, here's a supplement. The practices, the precedents of George Washington are hugely significant, far more important than constitutional text. Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist Papers, says presidents aren't going to be able to fire cabinet officers without getting the Senate to agree. The Senate is going to have to consent to their appointment and consent to their disappointment, their removal. But that's what Hamilton says in Federalist number 77. That's what people may have thought in ratifying the document. That's not the rules of the game today. The rules of the game today is that President Obama can fire any cabinet officer he wants at any time he wants, because that was established under George Washington, that precedent. Okay, so that's one chapter in the new book about the Washingtonian precedents and how you need to understand them as well as what the text says. Here's another chapter. Ours is a party-based system. We have a two-party system of the presidency. This is not true for George Washington. He's a man above party. Every single elector votes for him in 1789. Every single elector votes for him again when he stands for re-election in 1792. But we have a party-based system, a two-party-based system, and the text isn't so obvious on this, but this emerges from the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which completely changes our electoral college system. How did the electoral college originally work? You voted for two people for the presidency, and the top two vote getters became president and vice president respectively. So when Washington left the stage, Adams and Jefferson run against each other, and they come in 1 and 2, and they are president and vice president respectively, even though they really are embodying two very different philosophies, proto-parties. The sitting president and vice president run against each other in 1800. President Adams against Vice President Jefferson, and the intervening 4 years, they've really come to dislike each other, and their partisans have become very polarized. I know this will never again happen in American history where we've had political polarization, but just imagine a world in which you have people in one party really beginning to hate people in the other party, I know it's hard to imagine, but try. And now imagine that president and vice president are the leaders of these two rival parties. This is an assassination incentive. This is an accident totally waiting to happen. You assassinate number one, and your guy now moves up. So it's a very unstable system. It's changed by a 12th Amendment that allows you to have a ticket. You vote separately for president and vice president, and now people run with tickets, and now you can have political parties. That's the modern system. The word party isn't on the surface of the 12th Amendment, but it's between the lines. You need to understand that our Constitution was amended to facilitate a party system. Later amendments have increased this affirmation of the party system. Jack Kennedy wins a whole bunch of primaries, becomes president, and actually the poll tax amendment, that was our lifetime. You know, for most of us in the room, the 24th Amendment says you can't have disfranchisement, poll tax disfranchisement in primary elections as well as general elections. And that's a recognition of the role that parties are playing. That's the primary elections. That was Kennedy's path to power in 1960. He won, there were only 7 primaries that he entered. He won all of them and swept. But in our lifetime, we've understood primaries are actually important in the system, and certain constitutional rules apply to them. In our lifetime, we adopted an amendment that said if the vice presidency is vacant, Agnew resigns, so Nixon can pick Ford. And then Nixon resigns, and now Ford can pick a fellow named Rockefeller from one of these states. I can't remember which. So that wasn't true under the original Constitution. If the vice presidency was vacant, either because George Clinton dies in office, which he does, or because presidents die or resign and the vice presidents move up, it just stayed vacant. But in a nuclear age, you have to have a sort of a succession systems kind of in place. The 25th Amendment provides for this, and it allows the president to handpick his successor, subject to Congress's approval. This is a formal kind of codification of what the parties are doing, because parties increasingly are allowing the presidential nominee to pick his running mate. As late as 1956, some of you may remember it. See, Ike actually throws the thing open, whether it's going to be Estes Kefauver or Jack Kennedy. But since then, presidential candidates handpick their running mates. That wasn't true in an earlier era. The Constitution is reflecting this party practice. Sitting presidents pick their vice presidents if there's a vice presidential vacancy. So ours is a party system in a way that the founders weren't in. This is apparent when you carefully read between the lines of the 12th Amendment, of the 25th Amendment, and other provisions. Let's talk about one other amendment, since I'm really delighted to see that we have women in this room. That probably wasn't always the case. I don't know how many were in the rooms like this in 1918. But the 19th Amendment utterly transforms everything. Now, a president has 2 running mates, you see. He has his vice president, and he has his spouse who can succeed him, possibly. I know that's how could that ever happen? But the 19th Amendment, you see, is going to make Abigail Adams, she's the same person as Eleanor Roosevelt, but she has to keep Abigail Adams, quiet, because she's just going to offend the men, and women don't vote. But Eleanor Roosevelt from this state, you see, if she is a person in her own right, then Franklin tells all the men, well, I can't control her. Can you control your wife? But silently, he's telling her, you go, girl. And it's 2 for the price of 1. And this is Bill and Hillary, Barack and Michelle, Franklin and Eleanor. The 19th Amendment transforms things. Now, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were all eyeing each other, who's going to take over when Washington leaves, and they paid no attention to Martha, or Abigail. Al Gore ignores Hillary Clinton at his peril. The whole relationship is very different when presidents have 2 possible running mates and not 1 to succeed them. Let me be clear, without the 19th Amendment, Mitt Romney is president of the United States today. He won among the men, okay? So the 19th Amendment changes everything. And maybe, a senator from this state will be, part of that Yale Law School graduate going forward. I just want you to sort of be aware of the transformative possibilities implicit in constitutional amendments. Finally, the unfinished Constitution, the Constitution still to be written, the Constitution of the future. I'm going to give you 3 basic principles of what these amendments will look like and should look like. 1, they should add to liberty and equality, not take away from it, because none of the amendments thus far, with the possible exception of the ill-fated Prohibition Amendment, took away liberty or equality. They added a Bill of Rights. They ended slavery and promoted equality and later voting rights for blacks and women and 18-year-olds. So the amendments have added to liberty and equality. They haven't taken away from liberty and equality. So a proposed amendment that says marriage must be between one man and one woman, yeah, you can have that, but it'd be the first time you actually add an amendment, except for maybe prohibition, that cut back on equality. So that doesn't fit the story nearly as well as an amendment that said any two people who love each other have a right to get married. Two different imaginable amendments. One fits the story, one actually doesn't. It's been the story of increasing democratic inclusion and equality. Second thought, amendments are basically going to have to get the support of both parties because ours is a two-party system. One party is unlikely to be so hegemonic as to have 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. So as a practical matter, both parties are going to need to support stuff for any amendment to go forward. A bunch of amendments in the middle of the 20th century helped black people. DC got treated better in the Electoral College. We ended poll tax disfranchisement. What's going on with 18-year-olds are disproportionately non-white young adults. So why are these amendments actually disproportionately helping non-whites? Because blacks in the middle of the 20th century are the swing constituency. Okay, they are the Hispanics of the middle 20th century. Before 1932, they always vote Republican, overwhelmingly, not all, but overwhelmingly. After 72, overwhelmingly vote Democrat. In between, actually both parties are vying for them. They are Truman's margin of victory. If actually blacks had supported Dewey more than Truman, Dewey would have defeated Truman. Ike is trying to win them back. Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., is actually a Republican, party of Lincoln. So both parties actually supported various things because they're competing. Now, remember that. Amendments are going to have to be supported by both parties going forward. They should add to liberty and equality. And third principle, almost everything in the Constitution thus far, states have done first. They've road tested things. This is a Brandeisian point. Laboratories, experimentation. The future amendments, states are going to do things first. States came up with written constitutions first, 3 branches of government first. They had a separate Bill of Rights, which is why the absence of a Bill of Rights looks so odd to the ratifiers of the Constitution, because state constitutions had them. They ended slavery first. They gave women the vote first. They gave blacks the vote first. So almost everything in your Constitution actually follows successful state experiments. That will be true going forward, too. Lots of very good, interesting ideas. They're just not American ideas. Parliamentary systems. Pick your head of the executive branch from the legislature. Multi-party systems, proportional representation systems. There are many great societies in the world, democratic societies, that have these, but no state has any of these things. They have governors who look like presidents and written constitutions and enforced Bill of Rights and juries and judicial review. So states are going to do the things first. So now let me give you 2 examples of what could be your amendments. You could have an amendment that says naturalized citizens, people who have been here, who weren't born under the Constitution, but have come here at a young age and contribute, are going to be eligible to the presidency. You could have such a thing because that adds to equality. Just why should the fact that you were born in Canadian rather than American forever disentitle you, Jennifer Granholm or Austria, Arnold Schwarzenegger for being president? So adds to liberty and equality. Both parties might be in favor of it because the Democrats have Madeleine Albright and Jennifer Granholm, and the Republicans have their Henry Kissingers and Arnold Schwarzeneggers, and the Republican Party is going to, at some point, need to say what it's for and not just what it's against. They're going to have to offer some alternative to the DREAM Act. They can't always lose the Hispanic vote, just like they couldn't give up the black vote. And so they're going to have to say, we're for a fence, we're for a big fence, we're for a big electrified fence, we're for a big super electrified fence. But, fine, okay, I get it. But they're going to also have to say, here's our version of the DREAM Act. You come to America legally, you play by the rules, you contribute, and after 40 years in America, you get to run for president, just like everyone else. And that's what we're for. That's our version of the DREAM Act. And Orrin Hatch will support that amendment. Why do I know that? Because he introduced that amendment 10 years ago. I testified in behalf of it. That's when Orrin Hatch and the Republican Party actually, were reasonable. They've temporarily gone insane. They can't stay insane and win. They can win maybe one off-year election, maybe even a presidential election, but only one more. And then the demographics kick in. They've got to change and they will. And Orrin Hatch will come back because he doesn't have to worry about a Tea Party primary anymore, and he will return to this amendment that he believed in way back when. Both parties will find it in their interest to do this, perhaps. And adds to liberty and equality, and states already do it for the governors. Naturalized citizens are governors in Michigan and Florida and California and other places. Okay, direct election of the presidency. It adds to equality. It's one person, one vote instead of the Electoral College. It repudiates an Electoral College steeped in slavery. Both parties might be in favor of it because actually the Electoral College is not skewed in favor of the Republican Party. It helped George W. Bush, but it could have helped Gore the day before the election. People were predicting that. If Kerry had won Ohio by 50, he lost by 50,000, he would have won the presidency, the Electoral College, even though losing the national vote by 3 million. In October, people were predicting Obama could win the presidency even while losing the popular vote. He could still win the Electoral College. So the Electoral College doesn't favor either Republicans or Democrats today. So it's possible that both might favor reform. It could, it's an equality idea, one person, one vote, and states do it. Every state has a little president called a governor. And 4-year terms in 48 of the states, veto pen, pardon pen. Here's how we elect governors in New York. We count up all the votes. And if it's close, we recount them carefully. Call us crazy, but that's how we New Yorkers do it. And by the way, that's how we Californians do it, and we Texans do it, and we Connecticut people do it. That's how we do it in every state. No state has an electoral college. So this is a deeply American idea. It doesn't look foreign, like proportional representation, multiple party systems, parliamentary systems. So these are amendments you could see in your lifetime. There are more. 3 principles. Should add to liberty and equality, or at the very least not take away from liberty and equality. Both parties have to be for it, and states are going to basically be the laboratories of experimentation here. They're going to build on state experiences. Okay, 3 principles from the previous book, democracy, slaveocracy, national security. 4 from the new book with application to the presidency. If you forget this talk, at least for half of it, just remember Andrew Jackson. Thank you very much.